talks. You can take part in that by going to Slido, where the code is earnings gaps. You can put a question there and take part in our polls. People here in person can also go to Slido if you like, or be brave and put your hands up. But what you have to go to Slido for is to answer the polls, and then an exciting break from our usual format. We actually want you to get you guys answering a poll right now, if you can, to get you thinking about the topic of this morning's conversation. So if you are able to, in the next 20 minutes or so, while the panelists are speaking, obviously do pay full attention to what everyone's saying, but just over the next 20 minutes, if you could go to Slido, the code is earnings gaps. There is a question about your own experience of life in the labour market after university, and just to get you thinking about today's issues and how much they apply to you. And we'll show you the results after all the panellists have spoken. Just a tiny bit more from me about why this topic is so important. At a very big picture level, there is, of course, an argument that we might perhaps care a little bit less about inequality in income or wealth if we lived in a society with high levels of social mobility. In other words, one where everyone gets the same chance to succeed. But of course, we don't live in such a world at all. There's enormous amounts of evidence that that's not the case. Internationally, we know that the countries with the highest levels of inequality also have the lowest levels of social mobility. In which country is it the easiest to get on? It's Sweden, it's not the US. And we know from previous work in the UK as well as other countries that people's background casts a long shadow over their earnings and income as an adult. And it's exploring that topic that today's research explores. So Julia, over to you to give a summary.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Before I start, I just wanted to thank the panelists for being here, NAFI Foundation for the funding that enabled us to do this, and also my co-authors, Anna, Greg, who's in the audience, and Richmond, who's online. Thank you very much. So the title of our report is The Long Shadow, and we call it this because our core finding is that having experienced child poverty casts a long and dark shadow over graduates' earnings in England. But just before I go on, I just wanted to set the tone and sort of highlight how important going to university is in the first place. We find that at age 31, graduates earn about 50% more than non-graduates. But despite this big benefit and this boost in earnings for everyone, those who did experience deep poverty in childhood are far less likely to go to university than those who didn't. So we know that going to university is sort of a good first step to start to overcome these early life disadvantages. But what we focus on is on those who did go through to university. They did make it through graduation. So the key question that we're answering is that if you have done everything right and you've gone to university and you've tried your best to overcome all of these things, does deep poverty still cast this long shadow on your earnings? So just going to give a little structure of how this presentation is going to go. So first I'm going to give a sneak peek on the results just so that you can follow through as we go along. And then I'm going to go through what is very exciting for me but might be a little bit boring for you is how we got them. I'll be very brief though, I promise, though I could speak more about it if anyone wants. And then we are going to start going through the findings. So at a high level, what we are constantly going to do is comparing the earnings of graduates who did experience deep poverty in childhood compared to those who didn't. We're first going to do this at a very high level, what I will call a raw and unadjusted gap, before we start to find the role of any differences between these two graduates. And then we're going to start exploring these differences and how much they explain these sort of high-level average earnings gaps. Starting with the sneak peek on our findings. So what we do find is that graduates who were disadvantaged in childhood earn about 13% less than those who weren't. Some bit of good news is that access and performance does matter. So we find that those who were in deep poverty, because of the types of degrees that they get, these types of degrees explain a little bit of this 13% gap. Another bit of good news is that the earnings gap does narrow slightly as they gain experience in the labour market. And the reason for this is that they make good moves up the job ladder. And I will come back to what this means in a little bit. But despite this, the earnings gap doesn't ever really close as far as we can tell. Even after we look 10 years into their working lives after graduation, even when we compare graduates with the very same degree working for the very same employer. Now, the exciting bit for me is how we did it. So we do this using the longitudinal education outcomes dataset. It's a very large and exciting dataset that allows us to track the education, earnings and employment histories of the whole population of graduates in England. We track over 500,000 graduates who were born between 1986 and 1989. And we track them from when they're 16 all the way through when they do their A-levels, make it to university, graduate, start working on over 10 years into their careers. Now, our focus here is on deep poverty, and there's many ways that you can measure this, but we follow the literature, typically concerned with childhood disadvantage, and we use eligibility to free school meals at age 16. Now, this is an appropriate measure for older cohorts, older, not old cohorts. These people were born 86 and 89. But given the expansion of eligibility that is still ongoing, if we were to look at this today, it would mean something a little bit different to the deep poverty that we are looking at today. So among these graduates that we look at, around 7% of them, or about 35,000 of them, were eligible for free school meals. So when I mention graduates who were disadvantaged or in deep poverty, this is what I'm referring to. So going on to that high-level sort of gap finding that I've mentioned earlier, what this chart here is showing is the earnings gap between those who were in deep poverty and those who weren't. We look at this for all graduates, but also within demographic groups. And what we do essentially here is we look at them at 16, find out whether they did experience deep poverty or not, and then fast forward 10 years after they've been working after graduations, we take their earnings, take the average, and we find a difference of 13%. The first question that we ask is whether this difference still exists within demographic groups that we know face very well-established pay penalties in the labor market, like the gender and ethnicity pay gaps. But the bars other than the blue shows us that even within these demographic groups, this gap of around 13 and 15% remains. So this tells us that something other than demographic characteristics is going on, giving rise to this deep poverty's earnings gap. So now the next step is for us to start unpicking this broad average earnings gap and try to find are there any differences between these two groups and how much do they explain the earnings gaps? The first set of differences that we look at is the types of degrees that graduates who did experience deep poverty and otherwise have. So on the left panel here, we have the types of universities according to selectivity, and on the right, we have the degree classification or the mark they ended up with. Looking at the left panel, we find that those who were disadvantaged attend less selective universities. So for example, looking at the blue bar, around 15% of those who were in deep poverty end up going to the most selective university. So these are the hardest universities to get into. And this is compared to about 30% of other graduates who weren't in deep poverty. And this carries over through the end of the degree, the grade that they end up with. The sum of the blue and the red bars tells us that about 36% of graduates who are disadvantaged end up with the top marks at first and two ones, and this is compared to 44% of other graduates. So we know that these differences in the types of degrees graduates get are very real, they exist, and so the next step is to ask how much do these differences explain that broad 13% gap that we find. And this is the result that we get. So moving on from the 13% gap to the 7% gap, we do two things. The first thing is we control for demographic characteristics. And the second thing is that we look to compare graduates with the very same degree. So, for example, take two graduates who went to the University of Manchester, got a 2-1 in economics. The one who did experience deep poverty in childhood earned 7% less than the one who didn't. That's about £3,800 in annual earnings. That is not explained by the degree they got, right? Right, now the next step is to ask what else might that be within the 7%. We look into the labor market, so the types of industries and regions that disadvantaged graduates and other graduates work in. So on this chart here, what I'm showing in the green bars are the average annual earnings in different industries and regions, and the red diamonds are the relative likelihood of disadvantaged graduates being in certain industries and regions compared to other graduates. So we can see on the left panel that anything above 1 is a relative likelihood of being overrepresented. So in the left panel is telling us that those who did experience poverty are slightly more likely to be in low-paid industries, and carrying on to the right panel, they are also slightly more likely to be in lower-paid regions, but also much more likely to be represented in London. We ask again, how does these difference continue to account the gap, moving from the 7% gap? But we can go a step forward because the LEO is so comprehensive and we observe essentially everyone. We can also account for the employers these graduates work for. So in addition of controlling for the regions and industries they work in, we are now comparing graduates who also work for the same employer. Let me be very clear, the green bar here is comparing 2 graduates who went to Manchester, got a 2-1 in economics, and 10 years later are sitting next to each other working, for example, at the BBC. A 5% gap remains for the one who did face childhood disadvantage. That's about £2,800 a year, not explained by the type of degree they got or where they work. Taking a step back now, we have been looking at the gap at the 10th year after they've been in work and graduation. But what happens on the lead up to that, from when they enter university on the very first year after they graduate up to the 10th year? The very top of the yellow bar is that unadjusted, just simple average in earnings between these 2 groups. We can see that it starts at about 15% and it finishes at about 13% at the 10th year. Our question is, what is driving this narrowing of the gap? In the yellow area is the contribution of the types of degrees that graduates have compared to graduates who weren't disadvantaged. As we've seen before, that explains a huge chunk of the earnings penalty. But because it happened before they entered the labour market, it doesn't really change over time. When we look then at the blue area, this is the contribution of the employer sorting, or the movements of graduates who were disadvantaged between different employers in the labour market compared to other graduates. And we can see that this blue area here is quite wide in the first year and in the second year, but then it starts to narrow and is quite a bit narrower by the 10th year. So what this is telling us is that disadvantaged graduates make good movements up the job ladder. They start in lower paying employers and then move towards employers that pay more similarly to other graduates. And this is a bit of good news. But most importantly, the purple area. So what we call the residual gap is the gap that stays, the gap that is not explained by types of degrees or employers that they work for. And this gap starts at around 4%, ends around 5%, but it stays relatively flat throughout the first decade in work. And if you think about it, if you were disadvantaged in childhood, if you take away what kind of degree you got and where you work today, you would hope that at the very least, the experiences that you accumulate, the expertise that you develop, the skills that you have by the 10th year working, you'd hope that at least that would make these sort of early life inequalities, the impact of those, fade away later on. But that's not what we find here. So just to wrap it up and summarize, we found that experiencing poverty in childhood does cast a very long and dark shadow on the earnings of graduates in the labour market. Where graduates study, what they study and where they work helps us explain a little bit of this difference away. But importantly, a substantial part of this difference never really does go away, no matter how tight and narrow the comparison we make. This means 2 things. That first, some reforms to education and the broader labour market that would allow better access of disadvantaged graduates to better degrees, better employers, that we know that that would narrow the gap slightly. But because it never really does go away, this is just a really sad and stark reminder of the cost of childhood poverty. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julia. Anna, so as well as being a collaborator on this work, you've looked at this issue in other contexts, and also you've written passionately about the need for universities and academics to recognise this in their own workforce. But what's your take on today's issues?
Yeah, so thanks, Julia, for that great presentation. So my work is focused on this topic of how and whether and how class background or socioeconomic background affects career progression after education. So I think in many contexts, we know that socioeconomic background matters for how well someone does in school, whether they get the chance to go to university, what kind of university they go to, what kind of degree and grade they get at the end of it. I think there's often an assumption, although not always, that these effects of socioeconomic background are kind of washed out from then onwards. And unlike with, say, race and ethnicity or gender, where we have a lot of research, a lot of policy attention, a lot of organizational attention on understanding and trying to mitigate the continuing barriers in the labor market, that isn't so much the case for socioeconomic background. So a lot of my research focuses on this question, including this paper that I'm working on with Julia and Greg in Richmond. The striking thing that we find here that I want to pull out that I think was not known before is the finding that even among two people with exactly the same degree, these gaps are still large and persist. In the past, we've been able to find out and document that two people who had, for example, a degree from a Russell Group university would still go on to see labour market pay gaps. But to document that two people who were literally getting exactly the same degree at the same university in the same subject at the same time with the same grade still end up having a 7% earnings gap 10 years after graduation is the kind of big, new and striking finding I want to pull out. I don't think that is documented very well anywhere in any context, and certainly here it's a striking one. So I want to reflect a little bit on what might explain that residual gap, because it's not education. The first thing to emphasize that Julia noted already is it's not race and ethnicity. So race and ethnicity is correlated with having experienced poverty in childhood for some groups, and there are also disadvantages in the labor market. But this is controlling for race and ethnicity. It's comparing two people within the same group, so it's not explained by that. And one could think about this as additive, as a double disadvantage. Someone who grows up in a disadvantaged racial background and in poverty is likely to face both of these factors in the labor market. And the other thing to emphasize that we find is that it's not sorting. It's not explained mostly by people choosing to work in lower paid industries, lower paid firms, or lower paid regions. So what could be going on? So there's research that I've done in the American context and research that scholars like Sam Friedman and Lindsay McMillan have done in the British context that thinks about what could be driving these socioeconomic background or class background gaps within the labor market once you're already at an elite graduate employer. And I'd put them in three buckets, and maybe we can explore these more later in the discussion. One would be preferences or choices. Is it the case that people's backgrounds lead to different choices about trade-offs? You might choose to prioritize family and therefore take a job which requires you to work less hours or less intense hours, something like that, right? It might be something to do with awareness and aspirations. What is the set of possible jobs and career paths you could get, and how and do you want them, and how can you get to them, right? There could be big gaps on that front. Or it could be barriers. And those barriers could fit into a few different buckets. And for those, I'm going to draw on Pierre Bourdieu, who's the French sociologist who thought about different kinds of capital that people can have based on their family background. So one could be financial capital, right? It could be, financial capital matters again for whether you go to university and where you go, but it could still matter afterwards. Are you able to go and do a low-paid internship that's going to get you a really good job later on, right? The next is what Bourdieu called social capital, which we might think of as networks. Who do you know? Who does your family know? Who do your family friends know? Can they help you not only get into a good job, because we've seen that firm is not playing the most of the role here, but also get ahead in that job. Who's going to help you network within that profession and get those promotions? And then the third is cultural capital, which would be broadly thought of as what are your cultural references, social references, the way you speak, the way you present yourself, the experiences you've had of hobbies or going on holiday, and how those things implicitly can affect the ease of forming professional connections and feeling like you belong, and others feeling like you belong, and also can lead to outright discrimination in the labour market, and that those set of factors could also present barriers. So I think what we are excited to dig into with the next phase of this research is trying to dig into that why in these buckets. I'll leave it there and looking forward to chat.
Thank you very much, Anna. Imran, your colleagues at the IFS have been all over this data in past years. I know I've written about mobility of graduates, and you've also written about ethnicity differences in adult outcomes too. But what's your take on all this?
Thanks, Mike. So let me just start by thanking you for inviting me here today, and also I'd like to say a thanks to the unsung heroes who put this data together and make it available for researchers. I think it's absolutely incredible what we can do with this data, and this is a nice illustration of some of the important questions that we can only ask because this data is put together and made available for researchers. I had a couple of points, and hopefully we'll come back to some of this in the later discussion, picking up on sort of the notions of importance of different dimensions of capital that might be driving this. But I wanted to start by saying the results are really surprising. You might imagine that there's a world in which, for those individuals who come from the most deprived backgrounds, if they make it to university, if they make it to the same employer, if they have the same success at university, we would expect them to be actually doing better than counterparts. We thought, that there's some unobserved trait like their ability. We'd often think that those individuals should be doing better. And there's other examples in economics where we relax constraints to entering the labour market for underrepresented minorities, where we do find they're doing better because of that positive selection. That's not happening in this data, and I think that's a fundamental concern to any UK policymaker. The second issue is that the cohort that you look at, if I understood, were all born in 86 to 89. So if my maths is correct, they were just graduating between 2007 and 2009. So they're graduating into a recession, not just any recession, but the Great Financial Recession. We know from other work, individuals who enter the labour market in such downturns, it can often take a decade for them to recover. And so there may be important interactions with the macroeconomic environment that individuals are graduating into and their family background. I think that those would be quite useful elements to try to explore. The other thing that really struck me was that I know you're following the literature in defining poverty at age 16, but the nice thing about the NPD data that's linked here is you could have multiple different dynamics of childhood poverty. And I'd be very curious to understand if there are differences between individuals who've been in persistent poverty throughout their childhood versus those families who may be moving out of poverty and a child was classified as FSM early in life, but not so at age 16. Do they somehow do differently, or is the pattern very similar, irrespective of the stage of life in which you suffered poverty? That might give us a handle on the dynamics here and the role that families might also be playing. And then to come back to Anna's points about capital, I also thought that those are very striking intuitions and potentially important mechanisms. So one thing that's been shown in the US context is that a key driver of social mobility are social ties between low-income and high-income families. And one of the things that might be possible in this type of administrative data is to see how individuals who might come from different neighborhoods where those ties may be more likely to occur, either within the local geography of their household or within a school, might be important in terms of building that type of social capital early in life. And some of Raj Chetty's work has really documented the importance of having those kinds of ties. Other work that looks at role models in schools. If you attend a school where more parents are entrepreneurs, then you're more likely to be an entrepreneur, for example. That's been documented, not just for entrepreneurship, but a whole range of different occupational choices. Perhaps something like that is going on in the UK, or perhaps those channels don't exist in the UK in contrast to other countries. As Anna said, there's lots of frictions we know about educational choices, the likelihood to graduate, and success in universities, such as information frictions, resource frictions as well. But I wanted to come back to two other frictions that I think we sometimes lose track of, which I really think this research brings out fully. The first one is something my colleagues are absolutely bored of me saying, but almost every economic problem we look at in the UK has some relationship to housing markets. And the inability to be geographically mobile, to take up opportunities, either to attend university in a faraway location or to take up job opportunities because of frictions in the housing market, might be especially important for those individuals coming from low-income backgrounds. So I think, you know, in general, everybody should be working on this problem. Almost anything else we're interested in links back to issues in the housing market in the UK. And the final point is just what came out in the last bit of research, which is that even once individuals enter a firm, there seems to be a key block in terms of career progression within firms. And that's related to what firms are doing in terms of what they're rewarding, what they're recognizing, promotion policies, what we value implicitly and explicitly. That's something which I think you refer to as cultural capital, the returns to which I think we're just beginning to understand. So that seems to be as important for some of those persistent differences. We're doing some work at the IFS looking at progression of minorities in some very important employers in the public sector, such as the NHS and amongst teachers as well. I'm sure some of those frictions also exist in the private sector and might have a big role to play in understanding some of these persistent pay differentials.
Great, thank you very much, Imran. Anvar, thank you again to you and the Foundation for funding this. What's your take on this work and the topic in general?
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you, Julia. And I think I just wanted to start by, again, referring to the data and the brilliance of being able to do this kind of administrative data work and the analytical strength and confidence that this analysis can provide. And hopefully we can have a lot more of this going forward with these kind of linkages.
Hopefully Tim in the audience is blushing as we say all this.
Excited and delighted.
Great.
But I also had a few reflections about both the findings and what they mean for poverty and inequality interaction, and also for the policy. I think one thing to iterate is how important socioeconomic background is for employment outcomes and labour market outcomes more broadly. In some ways, I think it seems kind of an obvious point to make, but as Anna was saying, in some ways this has been at risk of being getting a bit lost in recent years in the way employment inequality policy has focused a lot more on gender and ethnicity, which are very substantive gaps in which we understand very well. And it's great that we can understand this gap better. And I think it matters not only because of the intersectional aspect of this. We know how compounding inequalities compound obviously between class and ethnicity or class and disability in the labour market. But also because I think there's an interesting political, sociological aspect to this. I mean, I'll just quickly refer to work by Ben Ansell, who's a political scientist in the University of Oxford, who did a bit of analysis around how reform voters in particular are different from all other voters, including conservative ones. And one stark distinction is how much less likely they are to think there is discrimination against people from ethnic minorities, and how much more likely they are to think there's discrimination against white British people. Now, we might very much scoff and dismiss such views, given the mounting of evidence we have around racism and its effects. But I think it's worth thinking a bit about how lived experience of working class people in deprived areas shapes these kind of views, and how more emphasis on class and its effects in addressing inequality in labour markets and education might help to reduce this kind of polarization, and reduce this kind of crud zero-sum lens that people apply from how inequality policy has been handled recently. Just a few comments on the implications for policy in particular. I think in terms of the education and employer elements of the gap, I think we do have some good ideas on how to address it. I'll briefly mention the work of Lindsay Macmillan, which has already been referenced, which we have also funded, looking at how people in 17 large employers progress during the graduation, during the graduate schemes and similar kind of entries. And what they very much find is that while people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and people from ethnic minorities are well represented or even overrepresented in the initial pool of applicants, they end up disproportionately falling out during the online or the face-to-face processes. even once you account for educational attainment. So we know that there's stuff that we could do in the way application processes and employment processes are handled. And it can be as simple as getting people from disadvantaged backgrounds applying to graduate schemes earlier. That's kind of one component of the gap. But the 5% residual is, I think, trickier to address. We've talked quite a bit about capital and various ways in which it's disadvantaged. I think it's also worth just reflecting on the extent of the scarring that deep poverty has. I think one obvious example of this is mental health and the way that we know how association with lowering income and mental health outcomes and how that might create issues for people throughout their lifespan, not just in education but also in employment. And I think that one final reflection I wanted to note is that I do think it is interesting that the gap is flat, but I also think it's interesting that it's not rising, because I think in some ways you would expect the social capital dynamics that were discussed to actually have a multiplicative effect on income performance. You have a better rapport with your manager, you talk about skiing holidays, you get a promotion, and much faster than your colleagues. So I think it is interesting to unpack this residual, and I think it's important before we get really deep into policy solutions and recommendations. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anwar. Okay, before we do the discussion, let's see what the poll results are. So this was just to get you engaged with the topic of today. We asked you, I won't ask the panellists to say what their background is, but I asked the audience to just reflect on whether they think their background has affected their career. So 40% of you actually think your background has held you back in your career. Maybe there are some posh Etonians in that, as well as some people from a working class or free school background. 27% of you say it didn't really make a difference. 24% of you admit that your background did help you. Okay, well, we seem to have an over-representation, more than I was expecting in the yellow category, thinking their background did hold them back. Well, thank you. That was just for fun. But that does, I think, touch on one of the questions, which is about the difference between class and poverty and background. And I just, and I can't find it right now to press on it. But sorry, Emma, you'll have to search for yourself. But the question was really, I guess all the speakers have been using different words. Anna, you said some of your words explicitly about class. Julia, you talked about sort of deep poverty. Imran's used a variety of terms. I mean, so I guess maybe I'll invite Anna to sort of expand on this. I'm particularly conscious of the fact that we are all economists at the front of the stage, all talking about class, which is a topic that sociologists think that they might, have a definition. So yes, there's the actual question. But I mean, the general issue is this about class? Is this about poverty? Is this about something else? Are these proxies? Are these exact measures?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, I think this is something where we would ideally have many different measures that capture different aspects of advantage and disadvantage in childhood, and right now we have one. And so what we are capturing with free school meals is having experienced childhood poverty. It's something like 15% of the children who were aged in our sample who were children at age 16 in the country were in that category. So it's a bottom by income of 15%. I think that is mapping onto one dimension of what we might think of as class or socioeconomic background, but only one, right? So ideally what we would be able to do, and I think what sociologists would do, and what we indeed will do in the next phase of this project, is looking at occupational background of your parents when you were a child, the educational background of your parents, did they go to university or not? Ideally you'd have a more fine-grained measure than that, but that's often hard to get. Ideally, we'd have finer grained measures of parental income and wealth, but we don't. The only thing you'll be able to see is free school meals and sort of the deprivation of the area you grew up in. But what I think we should be thinking about is big picture. We want a multidimensional measure of what were your financial resources as a child, what were your social and cultural resources as a child, and these are all proxies that are the best we can get quantitatively.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Anyone have anything to add on?
Obviously, as an economist, we're going to put a lot of emphasis on the availability of resources as thinking as being the key margin, and that's partly because that's something we could measure. It's something we have fairly concrete ideas and models about how having more or fewer resources change choices. That's not to say that other elements that come into this bundle of class, let me just call that expectations or networks or cultural capital. Those things we think of as being mattering, but I think we're much more uncertain about how they matter and how they might change with socioeconomic background. So I think that makes it both a challenge and an excitement, an exciting agenda to look into. Those other elements being really important, but to try to really understand when, how, and for whom they matter, I think there's still lots of work to be done on those issues.
Okay, great. Amar. Yeah.
I think just one other point to make this more complex is the intersection between class and ethnicity in this and the fluidity of it. I think I think it's useful to think about the differences across ethnic groups, across performance in education and labour market, because we know some ethnic groups outperform white British quite substantively, is about the dynamics of class, and particularly of their class before they even migrated to the UK, which is quite hard to track, but I think is a significant part of the explanation of why we see such substantive differences across different ethnic groups.
Okay, great, thanks. So there's a chunky piece of research behind this. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time allowing either the audience to ask questions about the research before we go on to questions about the implications of the research. I might start by picking on Tim, who's asked a couple of questions on Slido, but I'll there's a microphone coming to you, Tim. So I'll just ask a couple of your questions directly about the research for the authors to take on board, perhaps.
So first of all,
and then I might ask Greg to talk about what's coming next in the project overall, because I know this is only the first stage.
so as someone who grew up in deep poverty, if you'd have told me aged 11 that one day I would earn 96% of the earnings of a middle-class person in my career, I would have been elated. I think that's a tremendous amount of social progress, and we should celebrate. My standard of living is hugely different to that I grew up in when I was homeless at one point, my mum was a cleaning lady, etc. And we should celebrate the 96% as well as the 4% gap. But my first question is about the evenness of the 4% gap. Because if that's made up of a slightly bigger handful of middle-class people getting mega salaries in Goldman Sachs, and the rest of us all basically being the same, then that's a different story to everyone being 4%. Or if a greater proportion of civil servants from poor backgrounds are just doing clerical work, that's a different story again. So I'd really like to know more about that. I'd like to know it by subject studied at university and by university attended, although we'd have to be a bit careful if we name a lower ranking university with bad outcomes. If it gets bad outcomes for everyone but they're even, that is not a success. But I'd really like to just see some distributions and far fewer averages, because they can be very misleading.
Great,
but
thanks.
Well done.
Yeah, thank you. Greg, do you want to sort of either reply to that or talk about what's coming next in the project?
Yeah, I can do both of those things. I'm probably not on camera, which might be weird for everyone, but that's fine. But also probably good for them. So on Tim's points, we have started to look at this. And what I think we've found actually is, so I think my understanding of the gender gap is that a lot of the gender gap happens because women don't earn telephone number salaries to the same extent as men do. And at the median, the gender gap is much smaller than it is at the mean. I think what we found is that the opposite is true for class, actually. And there's more of a heavy left tail of low salaries amongst people who were on free school meals when they were a kid. But doing this with a data set of this size is fiendishly difficult. So anything to do with percentiles of distributions is just really computationally we didn't want to explode the ONS computers yet. But in the second half of the research, we're going to probably try and blow up the ONS servers. We're going to look at these other measures of disadvantage that Anna enumerated, and also this issue of like where geographically you grew up, because there are some quite good measures of that Imran pointed to. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to look at the job ladder in more detail. So we showed that this was one of the things that's actually working to some extent. So the gap, the people who were disadvantaged moving to more similar employers over the course of their early careers. We want to understand that a little bit better. And when people talk about job ladders, we probably also need to talk about job snakes, if you like. So whether that's because they move kind of more consistently up, or they have fewer kind of career disasters. The other thing I think we need to consider when we're thinking about this research is that this is all not only conditional upon getting a degree, but it's also conditional upon having a job. And so that margin of not being employed or not being employed is one that we haven't really talked about very much today, but it's probably quite important as well.
Thank you, Greg. And Tim, you talked about the 4%. It's of course 5%. So it's 5% unexplained, in case you were confusing people. I know. But I wanted also to combine what Tim and Greg have both just said. So there are different ways of viewing Julia and Greg and Anna Richmond's research. So one is to focus on the 5% that's unexplained. So if you're a social mobility kind of theme, that's what you focus on, right? Even two people do the same thing, there's still a 5% gap. Oh my goodness me, that's terrible. But of course there is, the raw gap is but there are other gaps, right? The raw gap is 13%. So there is an earnings penalty that is caused by the fact that people from deprived backgrounds go to different universities, choose different topics and get different degree results than people who are not deprived. And you might also think that's an outrage and that something should be done about that, just as much as you are outraged by the 5% that we can't explain. And you might be outraged by the fact that the proportion of people going to university is vastly different between those. So these are all in the report. I just wanted to, yes, and as Greg said, this is all conditional on having a job as well. So if you just focus on the 5%, you really are missing out so much of the overall difference between people who grow up in disadvantaged backgrounds and people who don't grow up in disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think that's reflected in the questions that are being posed. Some people are asking us to explore, or asking you guys to explore what happens at university, and some people are asking you to explore the unexplained bit. I think it might be fun to talk about the. I said there'd be more questions on the research, didn't they? So Julia, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to talk about the region effect, because that slide was quite dense. And there are some questions about that. But before I do that, are there any other questions in the room just about the research and what's been done? Yes, we've got a microphone. Oh, yeah, we'll take the lady over there, and then I'll think about whether to give Tim another chance.
Thank you. My name's Nina Slingsby. I run my own social sustainability consultancy and sit on the board of the Social Mobility Leaders Forum. The research you've done obviously is about people in employment. I just wondered if you'd looked at entrepreneurial routes and those that obviously come from a lesser resource background and those that obviously go down that as a route.
Right, so self-employment as opposed to employees, yes. Go on, Tim, you can have another go, and then I'll come to Julia.
Could you do it for earlier years where you've got a longer horizon earnings trajectory?
Thank you. So, Julia, do you want to take either of those? And if you want to give them to Greg, that's also fine.
Yeah, I can talk about regions. So what we've seen on the regions there was that those who were disadvantaged were slightly overrepresented in some low-paid agencies, regions, but also very much in London. And, you know, I came into this expecting that there was going to be a lot of regional, dispersion of these graduates, but that wasn't really the case. And what I think is happening here is that once you do make it through to graduation, we know that among graduates, these inequalities in where they live are slightly narrow. So I think that's what's happening here. But also something that Imran said that got me thinking is the issue of housing. Is it the case that these graduates as children, they were born and raised in London, which we know have really high inequality rates and poverty rates, and they were never able to leave? Is that why they live here despite it being such a high earnings regions? So definitely something to explore more.
Thank you. And there's a question which we won't put up, but the question is saying what's going on with regions, and I wonder whether, Julia, you could talk us through that slide you showed us earlier. So we'll give Emma a few seconds to try and find that slide. Yeah, keep going. That's the one. Yeah. Yes. Talk us through again. What is your data telling us about the regions to which disadvantaged graduates go to compared to non-disadvantaged graduates go to?
So as I mentioned, this chart is telling us that they are slightly overrepresented in regions such as West Midlands and Northwest, but also very much highly represented in the region of London, which is the highest paying of regions that we find here, right? And as I mentioned, I think it could be something about them being born and raised in London and sticking around because of the lack of opportunities of moving out.
Right. And I was desperately trying to remember some of it. Maybe it's unfair to ask you about your colleagues' research, but there's definitely good IFS research on the mobility of graduates, and I guess a great deal does depend on whether your parents live in London or not live in London, doesn't it? That makes
Or the flight to London from all the other regions.
Yeah. Okay. So the answer to the question is that yes, the disadvantaged graduates are overrepresented in some low-paying parts of the country, but they're also overrepresented in London, which is definitely not a low-paying part of the country when it comes to graduates. Okay, great. And then maybe we should move on to what does explain the missing 5%. Anna, you talked about your three ideas. We were talking in the green room earlier about the work of the sociologist Sam Friedman and his work a couple of years ago called A Class Ceiling. I know you're collaborating with Sam in other work, but do you want to, I know it's slightly, shame Sam can't be with here and it's slightly unfair to ask you to summarise someone else's work, but talk about what you've learned, what you took from Sam's work with his colleagues.
Yeah, and I highly recommend, if you haven't read it, the book, to read it. So Sam Friedman and Daniel Lorison wrote this book called The Class Ceiling, and they've also done other research on this topic. And basically what they do is look at a number of large UK employers in detailed qualitative studies where they go and interview lots of people and observe the employment environment. One of them is a large broadcaster, one of them is a large accounting firm, one of them's the civil service, and document a class ceiling, right? Like a glass ceiling, systematic barriers to career advancement for people from less advantaged backgrounds in these elite employers. And they trace this to several things. One aspect is within the firm being tracked or tracking yourself into more or less advantageous paths. So you can imagine, for example, in the civil service, there are parts of the civil service which are, kind of leading to more career opportunities within the civil service and more opportunities to get to the highest levels. And there are other tracks that are less prestigious. And they find that disproportionately, people from less advantaged backgrounds are ending up in these less prestigious tracks with sort of less of a springboard to the top. And they also have a lot of interviews where they hear issues to do with the capitals I raised, the cultural capital, the social capital. It's more difficult for people from less advantaged backgrounds to get mentorship and access to opportunities within these firms because building your network is hard. You may not know how to, quote unquote, play the game. It may be harder to form bonds with someone from a very different background, or you may be less sure how you would go about doing it. And all of these things compound to create this class ceiling type dynamic.
Great, thank you very much. Anything to add? No. Go on. Yeah.
We've been in some of the work we've been doing. It's been focused more on the progression of minorities in important employers, the teaching profession and the NHS. So those are both sectors which are minorities tend to be overrepresented in, but they don't make it to the top to the levels you'd expect. So in the teaching profession, it's even more striking because when minorities enter that profession, they tend to have higher earnings than the majority population because they tend to go to the most deprived areas where there are sort of pay premiums, but then they don't progress and eventually they get overtaken. I think something that's always struck me is sort of the narrative that people have described in the financial sector and the tech sector to a lesser extent in the west coast of the US, where people have argued that those ceilings exist to a lesser extent because there was just much more rapid change in the inflow of minorities entering those sectors. So in part because of the rise of tech sectors in India, changes in US visa policy, in a very short space of time, you had a lot of people coming from South Asia into those sectors. And maybe that's an inkling of how many firms can progress. It's not one person at a time. You actually need a very big change in a short period of time to force firms to adapt in what they might expect and what they might appreciate amongst a big change in the composition of their employees. I don't have any evidence for that in other sectors or in the UK, but it's something that I've always thought might be quite important to think about the pace of change and whether that's just too slow.
That's really interesting. Actually, can I just jump back in on this one as well? Just on the point of the class ceiling and how this relates to our research, I think one important thing to note here is, we're looking at the bottom versus most of the rest, right? We're actually not capturing private school students, I don't think. So we haven't got the very top in terms of childhood privilege. When you're thinking about some of the work that, say, the class ceiling work, that is not talking about people that grew up in poverty versus the rest. That's kind of cutting the dividing line a lot higher up in terms of the socioeconomic background distribution. And then that's also something it would be interesting to think about and study more, is like in which context do which aspects of childhood disadvantage matter. You might think that growing up in a very not at all deprived materially family, but nonetheless one that doesn't have any access to elite occupational networks is actually what really matters in some of these professions. And then beyond that, the other aspects don't matter. I have some work in the US where we look at academia, largely because that's where I could get the data on parental occupation. The Americans don't think about class very much, right? So talking about it in America is different. There's not much data. But in academia, we could get the data. And I found that within academia, there's a big gap between people who are first-gen college grads and people who have a parent with a college degree in terms of later outcomes, conditional on their education. But there's also a big gap between people who have a parent with a college degree and people who have a parent with a graduate degree, which in America is pretty much doctors, lawyers, and business people. They have MBAs. And so that kind of top portion of the distribution also really matters, and we can't capture it yet, but we want to.
Right, great, thank you. I mean, going back to the issues in the class, talked about in the class ceiling, there are a couple of questions which we don't need to show about whether unpaid internships are important, or even whether there are some industries, some occupations where how you speak is important. And I know people tell me I have a very nice voice, so I'm sure that's got me a long way. But of course, unpaid internships is, well, of course, your 5% of course is conditional on the firm you get to. So maybe the part of that 13% is because people couldn't get into the right career because of unpaid internships, but you control the 5% we can't explain with that, right?
Yeah, but it's important to remember as well, even though you're working with the same employer, maybe you've had an unpaid internship, around uni, maybe that's developed your confidence, your negotiation skill, your speaking abilities, and all of these capital forms that we've been looking at. So that's not to say that these things aren't important, and it goes back to the point of also being important to consider class as well as poverty.
That comes back to what we often refer to as the hidden curricula. Right, there are unwritten rules of how to behave, what they expect of you, the things you should be able to relate to in order to progress within a firm or within any organisation. That's true in academia, that's true in outside of academia. And I think those elements are really hard to study, but probably play a big role in that 5%, sort of those common reference points that make people like you, and when performance is partly subjectively evaluated, that's going to have huge returns.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to take any more questions from the audience in the room, or any topic you like. Yeah, we'll start with Heidi there.
Thank you. Apologies, this is a rather basic question. Imran, you talked about the year that this cohort were graduating. I was curious, so they're going to university 2005, 2007. What was the level of government support then? Because it was pre the tuition fees. But were there grants available? I speak as someone who was paid to go to university in the early 80s. I would never have gone if I'd had to take on any kind of debt at all. And I just, sorry, forgive me, I don't know the basic answer. Thank you.
Right, so this is a reminder of the context in which these people, how many, well, I guess we can also think about what fraction of the population went to university in that cohort. Mm-hmm. Is it unfair, Julia, to put you on the spot? Do you know the answer to those?
So they helped.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know the answer. Do you know, Greg? Do you remember?
So the fees were introduced in 1998, and then they were increased at like £1,000, and then they went up to 3,000. In sorry, in
Yes, sorry.
then in the early 2000s, I think, and then they went up to 9,000 in 2011 or 12.
Yeah. 12.
So this group would have been paying fees which are smaller than the current sets of fees, and then the maintenance grants, I think, were essentially maintenance loans by that time.
Yeah.
So they were borrowing more money than your generation or mine. I was the last year to have a grant and no fees, but less than the kids of today are. Although, of course, the terms of the loans matter hugely. I suppose one question is whether people realise that the terms of the loans matter hugely. Like, they think of a debt as a debt. They think it's like a mortgage, when the current student loan system really isn't like that. It's very much more like a graduate tax, it turns out, but it's just not called that, and it doesn't look like one. But remember, these we're looking at people who decided to go for it anyway, right? So and of course, this, there are these hurdles that people have to clear to get to be in our sample, or to get to be in the subject of today's talk. So getting the grades and then deciding to go for it, notwithstanding the costs.
Great, thanks. Anvar, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think obviously this is a cohort that's pre-tuition fee rises of 2010s, but I think it's one around it was a broad picture. The participation rates didn't really change of the 2010s, and I haven't looked at any kind of decompositional attempts, but I don't really think we have seen an impact on participation rates from the tuition fees. In part because, as Greg was saying, I don't think people were necessarily maximizing rationally in that way, and perhaps now with a more focus on tuition fees and their impacts, that might change.
Thanks. And Imran?
There is a related dynamic that might be especially binding for individuals from low-income backgrounds, which is, and this relates to the earlier point about entrepreneurship. There's increasing evidence from the US that when you graduate in debt, people are less likely to enter entrepreneurship later. Even if you could write down, it's not rational for them to be overly concerned about that debt. Psychologically, that people are, their choices are going to be different if they have that weighing on them, and that may be even more so from people from more deprived backgrounds. So that may, it'd be wonderful to look at, movements into entrepreneurship and how that has changed depending on how much debt you exit higher education with.
Great, thank you. Then quite a few questions about how can we solve this, which I think is a cue to look at our next poll. So we'll get you to answer that question. So yes, how should we close this earning gap caused by childhood poverty? The question is inviting you to think about what stage in the life cycle will be best. So are the problems coming from school? Is it access or performance in higher education? Is it what employers do in the labour market? Or do we need to think even bigger than that? So is this report really saying this giving us extra ammunition for increasing financial support for parents? Or is the only way in which we're going to get social mobility to tie the wealthy people's hands behind their back more because they have an unfair advantage? So you can vote on that while I invite the panel to sort of think, to muse upon the general issue. So where Julie, start with you. Where do you think this research is saying governments or people concerned with social mobility should focus?
I mean, if you ask me, I think arguably a little bit of everything. But in terms of the research, we found that this earnings gap is very much around half explained by where people went to university. And there is a very large body of literature that tells us that going to university, the degree that you pursue and what you end up with is very much linked to what happened before you even got there in school, right? So the grades that you got, the support that you had, and all of these things. And there's some evidence. So we know that we apply for universities using our predicted grades, and we know from evidence that disadvantaged students' predicted grades are under-predicted, even though overall grades are generally over-predicted. So I think, yes, definitely we need to increase school attainment, but also we need to work on what is happening with these prediction grades that are preventing disadvantaged students from selecting themselves into these great universities.
Great, thank you. And yeah, one of the questions online was whether universities can do more to improve access for students who don't go through the traditional A-level route, which is one.
Yeah, I think definitely.
Related point.
I think getting there is a great first step. We know that some disadvantaged students, controlling for the prior attainment, they will overperform, as Imran mentioned. So I think getting there is great, but if your performance within that degree is also dependent on the kinds of support you had before, then that might not be enough. And if you end up with a lower grade than you expected after coming into this great university, what kind of effect will that have on your confidence moving forward? So I think it's a great first step, but it shouldn't be isolated.
Great, thank you. Anna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to Tim's comment about, if you're a child growing up in poverty, what's your expectation of your gap? The biggest action, to Julia's point, is going to be on whether someone goes to university at all. And there's research from the IFS, Jack Britton and colleagues, that looks at the graduate earnings premium, and it's actually even bigger for kids from free school meal backgrounds than not, so that the return of going to university versus not is even higher. And this is the biggest thing. Then the second biggest thing in terms of quantity magnitude is going to be where you go to university and what degree you get. But I'm very passionate about the labour market piece because I think there is so much low-hanging fruit there. most companies are not collecting, and organizations in general are not collecting data at all about their applicants or their employees and what their socioeconomic background is. A lot more are collecting it than they used to, largely thanks to the work of the Social Mobility Commission over the last 15 years or so. There's some good toolkits for what they can do, but I think we kind of have a set of interventions we know can tackle things like gaps in access to mentorship, gaps in understanding the hidden curriculum, and we're just not applying them to this dimension of disadvantage in the workplace very broadly. So I think that is an aspect that is really important, quite easy for employers to do, and mostly not done.
Do you think, I agree. Do you think that is because people just assume that once you've got a degree, all these differences are wiped out and everything's fair from there on, or is it because governments or policymakers are reluctant to interfere too much with what goes on within the firm?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're talking about policy, I think part of it should be pushed by the employers and not by the government. So I think partly that, but I think it's partly that there's frankly like partly just a latent classism among a lot of employers, and also a latent assumption that people come from the same background by the time they get to this place, because often it might be less visible that someone has come from a disadvantaged background, and therefore less obvious that there might be a need to intervene. That would be my thoughts.
Okay.
Actually, I'll say one more thing on that, sorry, and then we can go on. The other reason I'm passionate about this labour market piece is, especially when we're thinking about access to influential positions in society, I think this is where, having representation from people from underrepresented backgrounds and less advantaged backgrounds really matters for having lived experience of the kinds of decisions, the impact of the decisions you're making. And this is why I care about this in the economics profession. And we should just recognize that economics is a really, really elite profession in terms of people's backgrounds on average. And I'm someone that came from an advantaged background. My parents were lawyers. I went to grammar school. I think we should have fewer people like me and more people who represent a broader range of backgrounds because of the work we do, and it matters that we represent experiences like that.
Thank you. Imran?
So I have no doubt that employers can change their actions, or universities or schools, but my answer to this question, I'm just saying this to provoke people, is none of the above. That I'm going to take the Heckman approach and say that we know that these problems start very, very early in life, and the later we leave it to intervene, choosing which stage of life cycle, it's not as efficient as trying to tackle the problem at source. The evidence suggests that early childhood interventions, in the first 1,000 days of life, are hugely beneficial. The rates of return to those are really larger than most other social policies we can think of. Tackle the problem at its root, rather than trying to ask universities or employers to make up for problems that are not of their making, and they're not best placed to always resolve. So, early childhood development, I would suggest, is the place to start.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Amber?
So I'm actually in agreement with Imran that I think the easiest way to get substantive returns is by targeting early childhood for all the reasons you raised. But I'm also going to be a bit provocative and say that it is not just about financial support. This is in large part about child poverty, but just because it is in large part about child poverty doesn't mean that the best way of addressing the problem is simply giving money. It would be great if that was the case, but quite a lot of recent research, some on AFS, on the effect of two-child limit on school readiness that we have funded, which found no effect. As some very big RCTs in America on the impact of income interventions on various outcomes suggest little effect. And I think we need to be quite targeted about interventions in early childhood, and not just things that cash is great, but cash doesn't solve all problems.
Great, thank you. Let's see what you all thought, or 63 of you thought. Yeah, okay, so I actually had early years as an option, but I crossed it off. So maybe some of this 38% would have picked, even earlier than schools. So yes, but they're clearly an intervene early kind of audience, which probably makes sense given the economics evidence. I think we're getting to the end now. I just maybe end with one point, which is, you said it, Julia, but let's re-emphasize it, that you were looking at children who were born in 1980s when getting free when they were 16, getting free school meals really was a marker of kind of deep disadvantage, and it's very different from the situation now or in the next few years, right? That was what you said, right?
Yes.
So what, and so we shouldn't think that children now growing up getting free school meals are necessarily going to be kind of tarnished with the same penalty that you're finding in this research.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Back when we were, for the cohort that we look at, I think there was only 2 types of benefits, and then it got expanded in the early 2004, 5s. And today, and it's much more expanded, and we're seeing an expansion going further. So yeah, free school meals eligibility today doesn't mean this deep poverty that, we look at today.
Great, thank you. I think we'll end it there. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for watching online, and see you at the next Resolution Foundation event.